Good evening. No, false start. False start. All right. All right. Good evening and welcome, everybody. It's good to be together. Welcome to those of you here in the sanctuary and to, I know we have many more who are joining us online. We will continue our series, Know Thyself, Know Thy Neighbor. I hope you learned a little bit about our Lutheran faith last week, who we are as Lutheran people. And tonight we're going to look at a little bit broader context of our place in Christian North America. Next week we'll go even broader. Pastor Peter is going to be here next week with a colleague of his, Dr. Mark Nygaard, who they're going to talk about the global Christian perspective, and they have some great stories to share. So you'll be in for a treat next week with Pastor Peter and Mark Nygaard. But this week I'll share a little bit about kind of my journey in between some Christian worlds and where I've landed here amongst all of you Lutherans, and consider myself an emerging Lutheran still. I think haven't quite been credentialed yet, but hopefully that will come before too long. But really glad to be digging in together. Let's open with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, thank you for this time to be together, to learn about our own faith, to dig in a little bit deeper, but also to learn about the broad differences that we have. Help us to see those differences not as challenge, but as an invitation to see your movement all over the world in different ways. Help us to see this diversity as your gift of creation. We ask all of this in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so here is our roadmap. We'll do a brief history of kind of Christian perspectives and how we ended up with all of these different sorts of Christian denominations and understandings. Then we'll talk a little bit about boats and babies, the church growth strategy of churches in North America. You might be a little curious about that. We'll talk more about that. We'll get into alphabet soup of Christian denominations a little bit, so you can understand some of the differences and similarities between Christian denominations. And then we'll lean into some of those categories and fault lines. And finally wonder, is this a curse or is it a blessing that we have so many different types of Christian perspectives here in the United States and indeed all over the world? So, beginning with Christian history, we are really following a story and a history of arguments. It's just a matter of fact, right? You get a church together, and what's gonna happen is people are gonna argue over something. Whether it's theology or the color of the carpet, good church people are gonna find something to argue about. So the story of Christian history is, in fact, a story of disagreement. It's a story of one party believing one thing and another party believing another thing. In fact, as I was reviewing a little bit, I found one quote that said, when most religious scholars studying religion look at other religions, they're looking at the differences in practices and how they do their work, do their religious practice. But with Christianity and the story of Christianity, it's really a story of belief. And what do we believe? It all hinges upon the word is orthodoxy, right? You've heard that word before. Right belief is what that word means. The history of arguments. So I'm going to take a minute here, and I know the words are super small, so it's really hard to see, but Jack's going to put it up on the full screen online for you, and I'm going to try and be fancy here. Oh, there we go. Yeah, look at that. Look at that fanciness. So these are the major branches within Christianity. And you'll notice that gray line at the very beginning there is early Christianity. So this is like this is like New Testament time all the way up until Constantine, who's the emperor of the Roman Empire, makes Christianity an official religion of the Roman Empire. It's a huge turning point for the Christian movement. And you'll see right at that yellow spark is that first big disagreement. Actually, when Constantine would be like 325 right in here. So 431, already you've got a huge schism of the Assyrian church and then the Oriental church. Pastor Peter and Mark Nygaard will talk more about that next week. But what's considered the Great Schism is between the Eastern and Western church. And that's in the 11th century. A moment that was highly controversial. There was a time where there were two popes, two leaders of the church. There were disagreements over what was believed, and also political power was a key component of that disagreement then too. And then we get to the next kind of great schism of the church, which maybe we know a lot better, which is in the 16th century, the Reformation. And you'll notice that it's not just Lutherans that spin off of this kind of family tree of Christianity. It's also Anglicans. Perhaps you know the story of the Anglican Church and its founding. And are there any royal history wonks in the room? Anybody tuning in for Prince Philip's funeral, may he rest in peace. Maybe we're alone in that. Hannah and I are deep. We just get into this royal history stuff. So when we started watching the funeral of Prince Philip, we actually turned on The Crown on Netflix and started watching it from the beginning all over again because this story is so fascinating. But actually, the story of the founding of the Anglican Church began with Henry VIII, who wanted a divorce and went to the Pope and asked for a divorce, would not get it. So his response was, well, I'll start my own church and it will grant me a divorce because I'll be the head of it. I mean, that's kind of crass, but that's the truth of the beginning of the Anglican Church. Calvinism, you'll see up here, we get our Reformed churches from. Presbyterian churches follow that Calvinist tree, and that sparked out of France and other parts of Europe around the same time as Luther, about 60, 70 years after Luther. And then you'll see Anabaptism, a Swiss man by the name of Zwingli began that movement. All of these Protestant movements that started all out of the 16th century. So this is kind of, again, a brief history of the arguments within Christianity. And some of the major arguments within this time, I know, just bears just having at it, right? Are around the nature of Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, the nature of sin, and even forming a canon. I'm looking back at some of these early disagreements, these early ecumenical councils. So what happened is the emperor called a council and said, there's disagreement in the church. There's argument happening. So we need to come together for an ecumenical council. And we're going to duke out this disagreement. And then we're going to vote. And the losers, they will be heretics. And they will be excommunicated from the church forever. And the winners will inherit eternal life, right? This is a pretty high stakes debate going on here. This is a really high stakes debate. So I thought that I would just introduce you to one of those 7 ecumenical councils. It's the first of the ecumenical councils in 325 of the Common Era. Okay, so this is 325 years into the story of Christianity. But very shortly after Christianity became the majority religion, or I shouldn't say the majority religion, the approved official religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity turned from being a sect within what was a really broad diversity of religious practice in the Roman Empire to this is what we believe because the emperor says it. That's a huge change in the story of Christianity. So it was convened by Emperor Constantine, who made this conversion to Christianity and made that conversion on behalf of the entire Roman Empire. And we've talked about this before, right? That like the story of Jesus is actually the story of challenging and uprooting the Roman Empire. A great twist of history is that then just some 300 years later, it becomes the official religion. And the question is what is lost in that translation? What changes in that moment? Pastor Peter, I think, will lean into that a little bit more next week. But the character of this council was of the nature of Christ's divinity and humanity. So are you ready to get into the weeds with me? We're going to get into the deep theological weeds tonight. Because we believe that Jesus is fully divine and fully human, right? That's like a Sunday school confirmation lesson 101, and we kind of get it in our brains and we say, okay, I got it. But then when you actually start to think about it, so how does that work? So in Mary's body was a fully divine and fully human Jesus. This council was all about figuring out how it actually worked, okay? And I'm not going to get into that thick of the weeds, but it's very strange. Another odd thing about, or not odd, important piece of this puzzle is that 50 Bibles were commissioned by Emperor Constantine. And remember, a Bible in this time would have been a significant amount of work, right? It would have taken a lot of investment. It would have taken scribes who would have had to copy pages and pages and pages of the Old Testament, pages and pages and pages of the New Testament. The other thing that scholars have question about is what was the canon at this time? This is the first evidence that we have of a Bible as a unit being published. And it's commissioned out of this council. So it's assumed we don't have evidence of this, but also at this council there was likely debate of which books should we be putting in this canon, which is a conversation that goes on throughout Christian history. What books belong in the Bible? What books don't belong in the Bible? Or even all the way to Luther's time, the question was, are there some books in the Bible that mean more than other books? Luther's very famous for despising the book of James, mostly because it didn't agree with him. So if you're making an argument toward the Pope, it's you don't want to shine a light on the book that kind of doesn't quite swing your way, so to speak. Also, Luther did not think very highly of the book of Revelation. Luther and I have disagreement on especially the latter book of Revelation. I think it's a really important book. I'm glad we have it. Also, please send in your questions. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a pause here while we get in. And Jack, you can put up the phone number on the bottom of the screen. We would welcome your questions at any point. I will stop a couple times intentionally and just take a pause, and you can ask your questions and we can dig in a little bit. We will get to contemporary times very shortly, but I wanted to just kind of lay some of the groundwork for us, some of the historical groundwork, mostly because I just think it's really interesting, and I hope you do at least a little bit. So thanks for indulging me a little bit with this ancient history here. Any questions so far here in the room as we're waiting for some? Yeah. Luther did not like James because of quotes in the book of James that sound like this: faith without works is dead. That's in the book of James. Now, that doesn't sound very Lutheran, right? Because Lutheranism is all about how, and we talked about this last week, right? That it is grace without our works. And yet James is leaning into the hypocrisy of a community that claims to have faith, and yet their actions don't respond in that way. So, at the end of the day, I think Luther probably would have had a use for the book of James, but he just, he was prone to exaggeration, lots of big talk, probably pretty grumpy at times, He was a character. He just was a character. Good question. Any other questions? All right, well, let's keep moving. And again, feel free to text those questions, and Sandy will keep an eye on what's coming in the room. Okay, so now we're getting right into the story of Christian history in North America. Now, there are all sorts of strategies for church growth, right? I mean, you get energy in the room, you get some good momentum, you get some excellent musicians like Tim Graff, and some good preachers, and some halfway decent preachers to back up the good preachers, and then you get you just get all of this really good stuff going, and we can be a church that grows together. But the story of church growth in North America is of boats and babies, and this is what a seminary professor of mine taught me, that it's of boats and babies, right? That there are boats that came from Northern Europe, and they would bring all of their traditions. So the story of Lutheranism in particular in the United States is of immigration from Germany, from Norway, from Sweden, from Denmark, into the United States, and then they would form churches and communities around shared language, around shared heritage, and they would form this really close-knit identity and belonging. And this is why in a very small town in Minnesota, like Alexandria, Minnesota, for example, my wife is from Alexandria, there is not one Lutheran church. It's a town of 10,000, right? 10,000 people. It swells, of course, in the summertime with many of us going up and spending time at the lakes, but a town of 10,000. It's not a large town. There is not one Lutheran church. There are not two Lutheran churches. There are not three Lutheran churches or four or five, but there are nearly 7 Lutheran churches in the city of Alexandria, Minnesota. And these started by having this identity around heritage and belonging. So some of these were Swedish congregations, and some of them were Norwegian congregations. And at one point, there might have been one Norwegian congregation, but then there was an argument, and so then there became 2 Norwegian congregations. We know these stories, tales of 2 churches. But this is really the story of not only Lutheran congregations, but also all of the different sorts of churches that formed within the United States. They're stories of immigration, right? We are an immigrant nation, and so they're stories of that Christian story coming into the United States across history. So denominations, and this is where we're going to get into the alphabet soup of denominationalism, is an innovation. And that's what I'm going to propose to you tonight. Denominations are something that formed within the last 100 years of the story of Christianity, okay? So denominations are not something that we have had for a long time. They're something that are pretty darn new within who we are. It's a way of, in the culture's term of branding ourselves, of having a shared identity around a shared set of beliefs and practices. They're not bad things, but I wanted to dig into them. So I'm going to trace Lutheran denominations because someone asked it last week and because I didn't know the answer. So I learned some answers this week. I went back and did my homework. I tried to interview my colleagues today, and I just couldn't get time with either of them. So I'm hoping that I'm still on the right track. Peter will correct me next week if I really go off track here. So the ELCA was formed the year that I was born in 1987. It is a whopping 33 years old, soon to be 34 this year. And it was formed by Germans, Norwegians, Swedes, Danish, Finnish as well. I didn't include the Finns, I'm sorry. Germans were the ALC, and there's an old ALC and a new ALCC. I learned all sorts of things. The American Lutheran Church. And they bonded with the Norwegians, which were the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and formed the new ALC. So when the ELCA formed, it was the ALC and the LCA. The LCA was formed out of the Swedes, which were in the Augustana Synod, and the Danish, which were in the American Evangelical Lutheran Church. You notice that the same words are just in different orders. So like it's like they just made a word soup and just said, well, we haven't tried this order yet. Let's go ELCA. We're done. It was the only one that was available after they put all of them on the whiteboard. So this is the story of a denomination forming out of a bunch of different sorts of shared perspectives and heritages. Many of them had their own colleges. So our ELCA colleges that we know, the Gustavus, the St. Olaf, the Concordia, Augsburg University, Augustana in Sioux Falls, Augustana in Rock Island, all of these were of these immigrant churches, Valparaiso in Indiana, all of these. Then, after denominations were formed as this innovation, and this was roughly, this work was happening in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Especially in the 1950s was this energy for really this broad ecumenical expression that started to grow. And so the work of the next kind of 15, 20, 30 years is a work of ecumenical conversation, of saying, we really agree on a whole lot of this, right? We agree that Jesus is why we're all connected. We agree that we celebrate communion together. We agree on so much of this stuff. Can't we just all share? Can't we just share? And what were they hoping to share? Well, clergy is one of them. So that clergy could go from a Lutheran congregation to a Methodist congregation or an Episcopal congregation and still be welcomed and approved for service. The other thing is communion. Can we have communion together? We talked last week about how the ELCA practices open communion versus closed communion. Well, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the conversation was around, well, what if an ELCA member wants to go have communion at a Methodist congregation? Would that be okay? And the answer back then was most likely yes, but we haven't officially talked about it all the time. So this is what the conversation was about until many of these documents and the full communion conversation. I'm looking at you, Jim Schimmelfinnig, because I figure you have a year on this, but maybe not. On Call to Common Mission, which year was Call to Common Mission was the final ecumenical kind of conversation with the Episcopal Church? It's like 90s, 95 or 96, something like that is what I'm thinking. I looked it up before this, but I can't quite remember. So these are the denominations, the alphabet soup, that are a part of our ELCA full communion partnership. What this means is that we really do believe some different things from Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Reformed Church and United Methodist. But mostly we believe the same things. And about the most important things, we absolutely agree. All right? So these are the churches that we just say we share a full communion partnership. So if I wanted to go become a pastor at a Presbyterian church in the Presbyterian Church of America, actually, it's not the Presbyterian Church of America. I wrote the wrong denomination. There are two Presbyterian denominations, PCUSA. The Presbyterian Church in the United States of America is different from the Presbyterian Church of America, the PCA. I wrote the wrong one down. You see how tricky this stuff is, friends? My goodness, it is alphabet soup. So if I wanted to go to an Episcopal church, I could be serving in an Episcopal church. Likewise, if you want to attend an Episcopal church and have communion and become a member, you're not going to have to be reconfirmed and all of that jazz. You're just welcomed into the fold. The odd thing for me as a young whippersnapper is that my assumption is that you probably could have done that without all of these big ecumenical conversations, but nobody asked me. They just had these big conversations. So I'm going to lean into these 4 dots and just give you a sense of the heritage of each of these major mainline, and we'll get into this in the next slide. But these are considered the mainline denominations in the United States. So Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we talked about that one last week. If you'd like to know more, go click on last week's YouTube video and you can get all about it. That's us. We're the ELCA. The Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, not the PCA, but the PCUSA, is a Presbyterian church. Congregations that are PCUSA in our neck of the woods are House of Hope Presbyterian Church on Summit Avenue in St. Paul. Anybody ever been into House of Hope Presbyterian Church? Gorgeous congregation. If you're looking for Gothic architecture, you can find nothing better in the Twin Cities. It is stunning. And the choir master there, Matthew Culleton, Hannah and I had the privilege of singing with Matthew Culleton for a number of years. The organist there is Aaron David Miller, one of the best in the Twin Cities. I cannot recommend checking out House of Hope Presbyterian Church. Don't tell Pastor Lilliard that I sent you all there, all right? No, it's a great congregation. I'm trying to think of other PCUSA. The Westminster Town Hall Forum. Anyone listen to the West? Fantastic. Another wonderful congregation of the Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA. One of my professors at Luther Seminary is a teaching pastor there, Matt Skinner. Again, another wonderful congregation. The next is the Episcopal Church. We talked about the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was formed in England and Great Britain out of Henry VIII. Again, the same Reformation spirit formed that congregation. Hold on. The Presbyterian Church is of Calvinist background, so that was the leader of the Presbyterian Church. So where we study in our seminary training the writings of Martin Luther, seminary students in Presbyterian seminaries would study many of the writings of John Calvin, and many of them are very similar. Honestly, similar themes, similar understandings. There are differences. I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of them right now because I don't think it helps our conversation a whole lot. Presbyterians are very well known for being well ordered. Structure is extremely important in Presbyterian denominations. My clinical pastoral education supervisor is a Presbyterian, and there are layers upon layers of committees and boards, very, very well structured in denominational expression. The Presbyterians are. Episcopalians. Anyone have Episcopalian roots? Yeah. Oh, that's great. And Sandy. That's right. So the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church is my favorite presiding bishop of all of the churches because we have trading cards, those of us pastors, and we just swap them. The rookie Bishop Michael Curry is worth a whole lot right now. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry is dynamite. He is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. And again, Episcopalians are part of a larger worldwide, they call it a communion, not a denomination, called the Anglican Communion. And so the Anglican Church in England is part of the Anglican Communion, as is the Episcopal Church is part of the Anglican Communion. The difference between Episcopalians and Lutherans is that Lutherans, we form our sense of belonging, our sense of identity around our theology. That's like core to who we are. Episcopalians form their sense of identity and belonging over worship practice. Okay? So the Book of Common Prayer is the guide for worship in Episcopal churches. And so you might go to a Lutheran congregation that worships like we do, and you might go to a different Lutheran congregation that worships really, really, really differently. And St. Andrew kind of does a little bit of everything, right? But some Lutheran congregations are very, very high church liturgical. Mount Olive in Minneapolis, if anyone's ever visited Mount Olive, has incense and a huge choir and every vestment you can imagine. And there are wardrobe changes halfway through the worship service, and it's a really different experience than it necessarily is here. Or you might go to a Lutheran congregation where the pastors don't wear robes, they wear blue jeans, there's a drum kit and flashy music. We worship differently across Lutheran congregations, but we hold to the same beliefs. So Anglicans hold to the same worship practice, but allow a really broad diversity of theological beliefs. So that's kind of one of the interesting differences with the Episcopal Church. St. Mark's is the cathedral of the Episcopal Church in our region. St. Mark's is right downtown Minneapolis. I'm trying to think of other Episcopal congregations that are known. There's a bunch of them around. St. Mark's is another really stunning congregation. I've had the gift to be able to sing in that wonderful hall as well. I would encourage you to go check it out. Episcopal Church is also known for a really particular style of choral singing, which is really different from Lutheran choral singing. Now we're getting into the music weeds, friends, so I hope I'm not seeing eyeballs gloss over. I'll just skip into that. That's Maybe that's just stuff I care about. We'll skip that one. Reformed Church of America is another Calvinist denomination, and then the United Methodist Church is formed from John Wesley, who was a missionary from England to the United States. And so Wesley rode horse all over and formed these communities around another, again, set of doctrine. And I don't know a whole lot about the Moravian Church, one of the smaller church or denominations in our full communion. I'm going to pause because I've been dumping a whole lot of information at you and see if we've got questions coming in.
I did have one.
Great. Thank you, Sandy.
Back to who determined the sequence of the books in the Bible and which books were included?
Oh, man. Who determined the sequence of the books and which books were in the books of the Bible? What's that? Uh-oh, he's running out of batteries.
I'm wondering if it relates back to the
ecumenical councils.
Yeah.
It does. There isn't a neat answer to that. It's not like there was one committee that then signed off on it and then it was done. What is likely true is that the Bible had probably been formed by the time Constantine commissions it. That there, and this again, this is scholarship to some degree, conjecture to some degree, because the honest truth is we don't know. But we know that these 50 Bibles were commissioned by Constantine in that first ecumenical council, and that's the first evidence that we have of saying, here is the Bible, and this is how we're going to share it in our communities. So the honest answer is that some books were just used more than others, and they were copied more than others. So there were more existent copies. And of course, the obvious ones are the Gospels, right? That those were the most highly used books of the Bible and shared amongst them. But they weren't the only Gospels. There were other Gospels that were in existence at the time. So the process over these centuries was that these were the books that were being utilized in Christian communities in shared practice. It is likely and true that there were some that fell off of the bandwagon, so to speak, that weren't used as commonly as others. And there are things that we can learn from those. We often call those the my mind just went blank on the word, I'm sorry. But some of these you might have heard of. There is a Gospel of Thomas. There's a Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And they tell stories about Jesus in a really different way than other Gospels do. But if you remember how Gospels function, they are to point us to Jesus, not. And they do that in different ways. So each of these texts do it in a different way. We're getting a little bit into the weeds here, but I do need to do a little bit more research on it because people keep asking this same question, and I keep not having a very satisfying answer. So to whomever you are in the next class, we'll figure it out, and I'll learn some more on it. How about that? Any other questions as we're leaning in? Okay, so we've been talking about one kind of cohort of denominations. I'm going to branch it out a little bit into Christians in North America. So we're going to talk about three major categories of types of Christians in North America: mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, and Roman Catholic. So I'm hoping to give you all of this language so that you kind of understand this. So Protestant, remember, that's the branch that goes off of the Catholic Church from Martin Luther. A big old branch, especially in the United States. Protestants are the lion's share of Christians in the United States. Not so in other parts of the world, right? There are parts of the world that are almost entirely Catholic, and Protestants are just a small, tiny quarter of it. And there are parts of the world that are, well, Peter will get into Orthodox Christians next week, so they would be another major category of Christians, just not in the United States. They're a very small minority. So mainline Protestants are who we've been talking about so far. Okay, Anglicans or Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Did I miss anybody? Methodists, yeah, exactly. So those are our mainline Protestants. Evangelical Protestants are a different kind of set, and it gets confusing, right? Because we have evangelical in our name, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. But when we talk about evangelical Protestants, we're talking about a different segment of Christianity. You often hear them talked about in the media, right? Evangelical Christians, and it's often a really broad kind of label. I want to give you a little bit more intel about that. Some of those evangelical Protestants are non-denominational, okay? You've heard that term before. And non-denominational is not a denomination, right? There is no denomination formed where there's a church body in a city somewhere where they have paperwork. But there are a lot of shared practices and beliefs of non-denominational churches. There are also denominations who are evangelical Protestant denominations. One of them is housed here in Bloomington, actually. The Evangelical Free Church of America is the church that I grew up in. The denomination that I grew up in is an evangelical denomination. Another evangelical denomination is the Southern Baptist Convention. And Baptists generally would fall into the category of evangelical Protestant. And so I'm just going to pause there. Any questions about kind of the difference between mainline Protestants and evangelical Protestants? And then we'll get into Roman Catholics.
There's a question about what does ecumenical mean?
Oh, thank you. What does ecumenical mean? So ecumenical means different sorts of Christians coming together to discuss what they agree on and come to some common ground. That's kind of maybe a working definition of what ecumenical means. That's a really great question. Really great question. Any questions? Any other questions as I pause? Would be evangelical Protestants. The question is, Grace and Wooddale in our own neighborhoods would be considered evangelical Protestants. The Methodist Church down the road, obviously, and all of the ELCA congregations here in town would be mainline Protestant. That's a good example. Grace and Wooddale would be considered evangelical Protestants. Yes?
Baptists, are there a lot of different? You mentioned one group of Baptists. Are they all evangelical Protestant?
They are overwhelmingly yes, but not all. How about that? So the United Church of Christ is a congregational denomination that is a Baptist denomination. And this is where we get kind of sticky, okay? As well as the American Baptist Church is another denomination that would be a mainline Protestant denomination. I'm going to get into, in a minute, some of those distinctions between kind of mainline Protestant and evangelical Protestant so that you can have a little bit more language about that. But really good questions. Really good questions. Yeah? I'm sorry, what was that? I'm Eckankar, and that's the one in Chanhassen, right? I really have no idea. So I know very little bit about them. Yeah. So I just don't know. Yeah. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses would not fit on this chart, depending on who you ask. Okay? So Mormons may say that they are a Protestant Christian denomination, but their theology diverges very significantly from any of the categories that are on this chart. The same with Jehovah's Witnesses. But these are really good questions, and I didn't include Mormons in my talk. That would be another one we could dig into. But I wouldn't feel comfortable giving it to you. Does that make sense? Because I don't know enough myself. But really good question. Yeah. Assemblies of God. Yes, that's another good question. Assemblies of God would fit into the evangelical Protestant category, but there's another layer of this that Assemblies of God would also fit into the Pentecostal category, which is not on our little chart here. But Pentecostalism began in the 1970s at the Azusa Street revivals, and is a big part of the global Christian movement. So I imagine next week that Pastor Peter and Mark Nygaard will talk quite a bit about Pentecostalism because it's the fastest growing expression of Christianity in the globe, not in the United States. It is growing in some places of the United States, but across the globe it's growing wildly. Yeah, these are really good questions. Thanks for digging in. I'm going to give us a little bit more language and tune in and turn the page here. So I'm going to give you some characteristics, and I'm trying to keep each of these in kind of parallel terms. I couldn't get them all to fit on one slide just because I wanted it to all be readable. So mainline Protestants are denominational, and I use that name because we're fairly ordered and structured as a broad brushstroke. We have a set of hierarchies. They're all somewhat different. Presbyterians are really well ordered by committees and have voting structures and all of those sorts of things. Anglicans are denominational by a little bit more of a hierarchy and set of kind of direct leadership. Lutherans, we are denominational, but we are a congregational denomination. So actually the influence stays here in the local church and then goes upward to the denominational structure, so to speak. We don't get marching orders from the synod or from the church-wide organization. In fact, it goes the opposite. We take some of what your generosity gives to the congregation, and we give to our local synod, and then the synod gives to the church-wide organization. That's kind of how both the money and the influence flow in our denomination. But those denominational structures are pretty shared among mainline Protestants. Mainline Protestants as a unit, and again, these are kind of broad brushstrokes. It's not the case of all mainline Protestants, are sacramental. We have a high regard for sacrament, for the baptism and for the Lord's Supper. That is different a little bit from church to church, and in some cases a lot of it. Baptists are one example. There are some mainline Protestant Baptists who fit really well into all of the other categories, but they're not sacramental. They are symbolic in that baptism is a symbol of God's presence, but they don't believe that God is actually there. Do you get the difference? Where last week I talked about how Lutherans believe God is in, with, and under the sacraments. Baptists believe that it's a symbol of our commitment to God and God's commitment to us. So that's kind of the big difference between that sacramental bullet point. Professionalized clergy, and this is a big one because this is absolutely shared by all of those mainline denominations, whether they're sacramental or symbolic. It takes 4 years to go to seminary to become a pastor, in addition to 4 years of undergraduate training. That's the same amount of time that it takes to get a medical doctorate. So this is a highly professionalized, and this all was formed in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, where seminaries started to form, and the training of pastors became a whole industry in and of itself. So we learn, I learned Hebrew, I learned Greek, I learned Latin, I learned a lot of theology, and I learned a bunch of other impractical things. So that I could be entrusted with these mysteries to teach you and to help us learn and be the body of Christ together. And then finally, and this one's a little bit overgeneralized, so take it again with a grain of salt, but head over heart. That mainline Protestants, we kind of behave this way. And again, this is a broad generalization. So St. Andrew fits into some of these categories and doesn't necessarily fit into others. But that the learning of faith happens by bringing our minds, our intellects, our imaginations into this, and then kind of settles into our hearts, okay? Again, really broad generalization. Evangelical Protestants, highly congregational in their structures. So when you hear non-denominational, what that's really saying is that we hold all of the power and authority here in this local church. And most of those non-denominational churches are also part of collectives, they might call them, or, ministry partnerships, which could also be called small denominations. You know what I mean? So it's not like they're totally on their own, but they're very congregational in their beliefs. That Jesus is calling that congregation and that pastor directly. They're symbolic, and almost all evangelical Protestants. I don't think I know of many evangelical Protestants who are sacramental in their practice. Less professionalization. In many evangelical Protestant churches, a seminary degree at an accredited seminary is not required. So some pastors and preachers in congregations don't go to seminary, but might just be called by that community and by the Spirit into ministry because of their gifts for communication and their gifts for leadership. So many of them do not require the same level of professionalization. That leads to some, it just leads to some arguments. I'll be honest, between clergy of different sorts, because we come to the table with really different sets of learning. And we'll get into some of these fissures later, and I'm noticing I'm actually being a lot more talkative than I thought I would be. And then heart over head, again, overgeneralization, but that like the sense of experience and feeling and participation in evangelical Protestantism is kind of emphasized over necessarily cognitive understanding of, and again, these are very broad generalizations, so not entirely, they don't entirely work. Roman Catholic, I'm using the term hierarchical. The power, the ownership, even the financial influence is by the hierarchical church, right? So when the diocese goes bankrupt, for example, they can sell property at a local parish to pay their bills, etc. If the synod in Minneapolis went bankrupt, they could not say, well, St. Andrew, you got to sell Spirit in the Pines so that we can pay our bills. You know what I mean? So that's a really strong difference between denominational. Roman Catholic is indeed a hierarchical. High sacramental. We talked more about that last week. The order of priests, very much professionalized, but can only be male, can only be, is a very, very different thing. And I would say Roman Catholics is kind of a both and, head and heart. The Roman Catholics that I know are really, there is a deep head knowledge and study within catechism, and you think about the high schools formed around and elementary schools formed around a Catholic practice. I think there's a both and in Roman Catholic. Okay, I'm going to take a break and answer questions, and then we'll dig in a little bit more. I see Sandy's got some coming in on the phone. Coming in on the phone.
It appears that the various segments of the Protestantism grew around a charismatic leader. Is Jesus, grace, and the Bible a common thread?
Can you ask that one more time, Sandy?
It appears that the various segments of the Protestantism grew around a charismatic leader. Jesus, grace, and the Bible are common threads?
Yeah, so the question was about like the Protestants all tracing back to one single leader. That's kind of, it's a yes and. I think yes, they all kind of point back to one person who sparked this, but it really became a movement more than, so Lutheranism is more than Martin Luther, for example. It was a whole community of people who really distinguished themselves against Roman Catholicism. So I would say Protestantism is a movement defining itself against Roman Catholicism as a whole. Following the charismatic leadership of Jesus, and I follow that. But I think it's a little more than that. Yeah, good questions.
And another one, with this sense of full communion with other Protestant denominations, is this why we see so many participants in Church Anew and professors at Luther Seminary from a variety of backgrounds?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because of our full communion partnership, is that why we see so many different folks participating in Church Anew? Church Anew as a strategy, and if I lead Church Anew, so you give me time to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it. We reach out to our full communion folks. That's kind of where we build our team, so to speak, if that makes sense. And we try to be ecumenical at Church Anew because the world is very ecumenical. People just come from a wide variety of backgrounds. And because as we've tried to build Church Anew, we don't want it just to be Minnesota, which is very Lutheran ELCA. We want folks in Canada to be welcome. In fact, I just got an email from somebody in Canada who said, please change your form so that all of our Canadian people feel welcome. Absolutely. We totally miss it. So we keep trying to just create more open doors. And we do that by linking ourselves to people who aren't exactly like us. That's our strategy there. I'm going to lean into the rest of this because I think these belief fault lines are really important to understand. And I'm just going to run through two of the main ones, and then I'll kind of list some of the other ones as well. But the Bible and how we read the Bible is probably the biggest fault line in American Christianity, okay? This is it. Like, this is the biggie. And everything else flows out of it, okay? The word that I've shared with you before is the word inerrant. And that word means that that the Bible is without error, okay? No spelling error, no misplaced commas, no error of perspective, no error of the times that were of that time, that it is without error. And that's, it was part of the debates of Christianity before 1978, but it was formalized into a statement, again, that seems very denominational, even for congregations that consider themselves non-denominational, called the 1917 Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy, where a bunch of American evangelical Protestant pastors, all of them white and all of them men, got together, actually that's not dissimilar from the founding of the ELCA, to be honest, got together and agreed on this statement that the Bible is completely inerrant. It's a statement against, and again, what's called the historical critical method, which is what all of your pastors were brought up in. Okay, so I'm showing you my cards a little bit. That this is the tradition that I was raised in, that I have commuted from, so to speak, that I've moved from. I grew up in an inerrant, Bible-believing congregation. Any questions about that kind of doctrine of biblical inerrancy? Okay. The next one is, I skipped one, sorry. Shoot. Oh man, I had one in here. Okay, the other one is about fundamentalism and modernism. Has anyone heard the term fundamentalist? So fundamentalism believes that the doctrines, not only the Bible, but the doctrines of Christianity should never change with the times. Never. So what that leads to is fault lines like this. Like the belief in end times, that's another major fault line between Catholics and evangelicals and mainline Protestants. The role of women is another fault line because of some of the letters of Paul and some of the letters in the New Testament that indicate that women should not lead in church. Because it says that, and because the Bible is inerrant, and because we should never change our doctrine, then that stays the same. Also LGBTQ affirmation, and also the role of scholarship in the Bible, it's a belief that we're not going to learn something new about the Bible. Does that make sense? That we might discover a new text that tweaks some of the language, but it stops there. Anyway, that's fundamentalism in a nutshell. And then finally, science and faith. And I'm going to use an example of this, the example of evolution, and I'm just going to lead with questions. Can science teach us differently than the Bible can? Can it teach us different things than the Bible can? And is Genesis, which is the book that tells us about God's creation of the world, is it intended to teach us how the earth was created? Or perhaps my argument would be why the earth is created or who created the earth. These are some of the ways that we get into some of the major fault lines in Christianity. And okay, I'm going to pause before I get to the next slide. Any questions? We're running a little low on time too here. I've got more to come. Any questions? Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, the Bible is at the core, and use the Bible as inerrant, if that makes sense. Yeah. A literal interpretation is another way to understand that. My frustration with a literal interpretation is that I read the Bible literally too, and the Bible literally contradicts itself at times. So how do you reconcile it? Those are some of the troubles that we get ourselves into. But the reading of the Bible and how we read the Bible is how all of those other arguments, they all flow out of it. So that's really the big one. It's the big one. Any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to turn a page. This is a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. I've missed a whole swath of Christian America up until now. Okay? And this is how I heard this story. So I told it to you how I heard it. But my learning of this is that this part of the story is really about white Christian America. The founding of denominations, all of that structuring and ordering and the differences and the arguments. And it really isn't the story of black Christian America or of immigrant. It is immigrant Christian America to some degree, but contemporary immigrant Christian America is where I'm really imagining that. So I'll start with kind of contemporary immigrant Christian America, and you'll hear a lot more about this next week, so I'm just going to touch on it really briefly. But Pentecostalism, I mentioned, is the fastest growing movement within Christianity, and that's coming from the global south, so South America, Africa, as well as the east, so Asia, places like Korea and, or South Korea, I should say, and the Philippines, really wildly fast growing Christian congregations, some of the largest Christian congregations in the world. They're not in the United States, definitely. The largest Christian congregations are in the East and in the global South, and far and above their Pentecostal congregations. But culture building, right? Immigrant congregations are a place where culture is maintained and formed and developed. And the story of black Christian America, has anybody gotten a chance to see the Black Church on PBS? I haven't seen it yet, Mary, but I've heard remarkable things about it. So I would really commend it to you as a follow-up to this, to really, because I can't do it justice, and I'm not going to try. So if this is something that you want to do some learning in, and I know some of our IDI groups have done some conversation around this too, I would really recommend watching the Black Church. This is my story, this is my song. It's free, it's on PBS, you can look it up. I think they have the whole thing on YouTube if you'd rather watch it there. But a really remarkable telling of the story of how Christianity functioned to keep enslaved people enslaved, right? This is how Christianity functioned on plantations. Plantation owners, another movie that I'd recommend is The Birth of a Nation. It was a 2016, 2017 film about a slave who was trained to be a preacher and to preach only the texts that say, like in Timothy, slaves be obedient to your masters, and to teach the parts of Scripture that reinforce the system of slavery. Now, we as readers of the Bible today know that indeed the Bible says a whole lot about the liberation from slavery. So the story of the Black church in the United States is in fact of slaves being forced to go to plantation churches, but then stealing away. And maybe you've heard the hymn "Steal Away." Tim did a really beautiful arrangement of it a few weeks ago. but stealing away to have their own prayer meetings, where really the culture building happened, where really the beginnings of liberation and of freedom, the imaginations began to happen. So I'll go back to that quote of Martin Luther King Jr. before we end, but that indeed the 11 o'clock is the most segregated hour in America. Dr. King was highly critical of white moderate preachers, and this is something that we often miss. Highly critical of white moderate preachers. Because we live in a time where we're kind of beyond it, but much of his writing was directed, fiery writing, at white moderate preachers. Because he was trying to awaken in white congregations an empathy and a compassion for the civil rights movement, and was effective at it in some and very much not in a lot of others. But I want to go back to this, that sometimes we as white Christians get in this mode of, well, yeah, it's the most segregated hour in America, and we should just get more people of color and more diversity within our congregations. And how can we work to be more hospitable and more welcoming so that we can have a more diverse congregation? Which is a noble goal, right? I mean, all of those things are noble things. We should absolutely work on them. But I think what we miss is that perhaps the intention of God's promise for us as human beings is to have broad diversity of experiences. And not that everyone should feel, I'm trying to say this carefully, everyone should feel welcome here, but that perhaps a different expression of Christianity we can learn from. And we can appreciate and value and cherish in its uniqueness and its set apartness. To not say, "Oh yeah, we should have that be a part of ours too." You see the difference there? It's subtle, but it's definitely a difference. And I go back to, and I want to end with two stories. The story of the Tower of Babel. This was a Sunday school story for me, but I grew up in a fundamentalist, biblically inerrant congregation. So I studied a lot of the Bible. I memorized a lot of the Bible. The story of the Tower of Babel happens in Genesis. And it happens after the Adam and Eve. And in the story of Adam and Eve, the snake goes to Eve and says, if you eat of this fruit, and if Adam eats of this fruit, you will be like God. That's the sin at the beginning of creation. You will be like God. And so then the rest of this first half of Genesis goes through this de-evolution of humankind. That they start to fight and argue and even murder, right? That Cain kills Abel, and then it gets bigger and whole communities are fighting amongst themselves. And it ends with this story before it leans into Abraham and Sarah and kind of God's promise into Genesis. It's a hinge point of that first book of the Bible. And the people, they decide that they should speak one language. It says that in the Bible. It says we should decide that we can speak one language because we'll be more efficient that way. And it makes sense, right? Like we can understand one another. We can get more work done. And it says that they start to build a tower that could reach up to the heavens. Now, the only thing in the ancient world that lives in the heavens is the throne room of God. So the reason that these ancient people, and this story in particular, is they wanted to build a tower that they could climb all the way up and look God right in the eyeballs, so that they could be, like the serpent said, like God. So perhaps, then at the end of the story, God scatters them and says, nope, I'm going to destroy the tower, scatter you, and now you'll speak in all sorts of different languages and you can't understand one another. But perhaps the error in that story is on humankind's behalf, and the gift is on God's, to say we are intended to be people of difference. We are intended to be people who think differently. We are intended to be people who speak differently and act differently. And then ultimately in the book of Acts, chapter 2, we get the story of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit comes into this gathering of these early Christians. And what, some people say it's a reversal of this story of Babel. They can all get along. They can be more efficient and they can be a beautiful community of believers and amazing. But actually, if you read the story carefully, they don't speak the same language. They speak different languages. The miracle in that is that they can understand one another. So may this be our call as people of Christ, to be bold in our difference, to be bold in our diversity, but to seek to understand one another, to seek to listen so carefully that we can hear the hopes, that we can hear the dreams, that we can hear the longings in our religious neighbors. If there's any impulse in these 6 weeks that we're pulling in together, it's really that. How can we seek to understand and therefore better support and be better neighbors? If it's our call as Lutherans and we can live boldly into that call to be neighbors and to be the best neighbors that we can be, then we have to understand one another. We have to understand one another's perspective. We're at 7:34. I'm long-winded tonight, friends. I'm happy to stay after if people have questions. Are there additional questions that came in, Sandy? If not, we'll shut down the stream and you can email them to me, and I'm happy to respond. If not, I'll happy to stay for the folks in the room. But let's close in a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for the marvelous diversity that you have created. A tapestry of human beings of every color and shape and size and creed and belief. So help us in our attempts to understand one another. Help us to listen carefully. Help us to be better friends and neighbors and colleagues. In all of this, help us to hear the best in our neighbor, to seek the best, and to hope for the best that you have for all of creation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Go in peace, serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.